Well, hey there, this is Cindy, and thanks so much for joining us today. And I'm so glad you're here, and I cannot wait for you to hear today's episode. But before we dive in, I wanted to share some ways that we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills. I've got everything from online to group to my signature one-on-one mastermind and VIP experiences available to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. Sounds interesting? Check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And now, for the real reason that you are here with us today, let me introduce you to Cebien Alty. Cebien, it's so great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy, for the opportunity. I'm glad that we were able to make this happen. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And today for our listeners, we're going to be talking about a combination of things, but negotiating workplace development strategies. And I had the great pleasure, for those of you who don't know Cebien, I was lucky enough to come across him on Clubhouse, and every room he ever showed up in, he is always just so articulate and compassionate and knowledgeable. And I love his insights about negotiation and how to do it better. So I have been tracking him down for you so that you can benefit from some of his gems here today. He's a corporate strategist. He's got over 2 decades of experience in the marketplace, and he serves as the senior principal consultant for CBeyond Enterprises. Love that name, by the way, Cebien. And he provides career readiness strategies and DEI talent solutions. So why don't you kickstart us off, Cebien, and tell us about how you came to do this work?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I love, as you know, these conversations because they're so necessary, right? There's
Yes.
so much work that we've done in the marketplace across industries, but there's so much more work to be done. And so this is what I call some of my passion work. But yeah, I actually have been doing this work for quite some time. You read a little bit of my bio. And so for the past 15 or so years, I've been in the leadership development space doing a lot of the DE&I work before DE&I was a thing, right? And so
That's true.
little sectors, right? We've been doing this work, and so all of a sudden everyone is doing DE&I work. And so I have been working with young Black and Brown professionals in the leadership development space. And then a couple years back, actually pre-pandemic and pre the Great Resignation, I pivoted from corporate because I wanted to expand the reach of the work that I was doing within my leadership job, right? And so I wanted to make more impact and do it without asking permission. You know, when you're part of an organization or that machine, there are tiers and layers of red tape or approvals that you have to go
Yeah.
through. And for me, some of those things didn't make sense. And it stalled sort of the transformation and impact or the depth of impact that I wanted to make. And so I transitioned full time and started building my personal brand and expanding what I was doing on the side into a full-blown business, which is through my organization, CBeyond Enterprises, right? And so the work that we do is really working with our Black and Brown professionals to really make sure that they are well positioned in the marketplace to excel from
Yeah.
day one, right? And so a lot of the interview prep, resume development, all of that stuff we do, but the core work is really building that confidence to have some of these critical and important conversations that I've engaged with you and I've observed and listened to you engage with others. And so that's the work that we do. It's my passion work. It's what I continue to do because it is necessary work, regardless of the generations that come and go. This work is relevant. It's relevant, and I find that it will never, unfortunately, right, or fortunately, is something that will never go away in the near future, at least not in my lifetime. But we continue doing the work so we can sort of diminish the need, the consistent need to have these crucial and sensitive conversations.
Yeah. And kudos to you for taking it on before it was a thing, as you say, and recognizing the importance. I mean, this is a group that has been so underserviced for so long. There is so much social conditioning. I can't wait to unpack it. But I also really want to get hats off. I love that you're speaking to the elephant in the room, which is that, fortunately or unfortunately, we're always going to have these discussions. And I think that's the group with any group that has been, oppressed or under-recognized or undervalued through history. We think we get to a stage where, we've made progress. And so you take your foot off the gas and then we slide back. And, we certainly saw how quickly that happens on both gender and race issues recently in the US with political swings. And so definitely a relevant conversation. Totally agree. It will always be a relevant conversation. Now, you spoke to brand about building your brand, and I know one of the things your brand focuses on is providing that, meaningful workplace development strategies. And I know you do it for both job seekers and employers. So tell our listeners a little bit, what does that mean, impactful workplace development strategies?
Yeah, so Here's the thing, Cindy. I find that we overcomplicate these things. I was recently sharing a piece of content about really talent acquisitions and these companies that really struggle with finding the right talent. And
Yeah.
so, to that conversation, I was lending my perspective of we talk about, having a hard time finding the right talent and filtering through top tier talent, but yet we put these parameters. And when I say we, I mean organizations, companies,
Yeah.
et cetera, folks that hire individuals. We put these parameters, these restrictive parameters, right? But yet we say we want to bring
Yes.
in talent. And yet
Yes.
we say we're struggling to find talent,
Yes.
but we are putting filters such as, XYZ amount of experience required, XYZ degree
Yes.
required, it must be at this day and age, must be in person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and not disclosing full transparency when it comes to salary range, et cetera. So that brings on a whole nother layer of confusion and unnecessary work. And so the work that I do is really making sure that job seekers, one, when they're out there in the market, understand the conversations or the questions to ask when having these critical conversations and going into the job search journey. And then on the other side with the companies, really guiding and having them flush out processes, so talent management and talent acquisition processes, so that they are very clear and
Yeah.
very concise, right? And that they are rapid flowing for both them and the individuals going through them, so they can get to the end goal, which is really onboarding and bringing that talent in-house so they can start getting the impact
Yeah.
and seeing the results that they all want on both sides,
Yeah.
both on the career development side and for the company, the bottom line, right? And
Yeah.
so in impacting the market based on services and or products that they're putting out there.
Yeah. And I think it's so brilliant and unusual, sadly, that you're doing both of the sides of the equation, right? Where you're looking at the employers and what they need. Because we've become a society, I find, that's so polarized, right? In everything. Our legal system is set up as competitive, adversarial. It's us and them. And a lot of times, I think doing DEI work as well, people tend to see it as sides, right? It's that us against them. So I actually think it's brilliant because you can accomplish so much more when you open up, come from that place of curiosity and looking at what are the barriers here and how can we flip the mindsets for people in a way that benefits everybody so they get these more creative solutions. I mean, that's at the heart of what really great negotiation is about. So kudos to you. Now, I was wondering if you could tell us how, when you're dealing with your particular client base as well, and you talked about, a little bit about that conditioning, those opportunities necessarily they haven't had and getting that confidence up. I'd love if you could share some tips with our audience here about, what are some of the ways that you help push back some of those limiting beliefs? How do you get them to flip maybe some of the stories they've been telling themselves that are holding them back from stepping into the fullness of their power?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the work that I do is very tactical, but I always at the end of the day say I just build confidence because all I do is really pull across those layers and really show you how to just really believe in what you are bringing to the table
Yeah.
and be unapologetic for it. And not unapologetic in a way to where you're boastful or arrogant, but that you're confident
Yes.
that when you are actually applying to that job, that you actually believe that when you get that win, when you get that call back, that you're able to successfully navigate through that pre-screen and then eventually make that conversion over to the interview process and then into the offer stage. And so some of the tips that I give to job seekers up front is making sure that they are really doing the work up front to make sure that they actually align with the core values of an organization, right? And so you see these opportunities, you see these job descriptions, and they look all appealing and all of that, and then you
Yeah.
apply, but then yet you don't align with the core values of the organization, or you don't put in the due diligence to do the
Yeah.
pre-work. And I'm a big fan of informational interviews, coffee chats, etc. I always tout that, right? Not doing the pre-work in reaching out to current and past, right, employees to really have these candid conversations and informal conversations about here's what I'm looking to do. You're in an organization or you've been part of this organization. What are some of the sort of unknowns that I should know in going into an employer like this, right? Here are the goals that I have for my particular career path. Am I able to achieve this, or does it make sense for me to put myself in this work environment?
Yeah.
And so doing some of that pre-work and taking advantage of informational interviews, connecting with recruiters, right? Having those conversations and not being afraid once you are actually in the interview process if something is off, right? Or you're being interviewed by a certain group of folks that don't look like you.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask, hey, is it possible for me to talk to who would be my peers within this role? And
Yeah.
being, I would say, bold enough, right? To
Yeah.
act that, because one, you want to make sure that you're a value add to them, and that two, they're a value add to you as well based on your career progression. The other thing that I also give is, so one, that's informational interviews and doing that pre-work up front by looking at the organization's core values, company culture, and making sure that that fits and aligns with your even short-term goals,
Yes.
right? And then aside from that, just making sure that you are tracking your performance once you're actually at the table. And so the worst thing that can happen is you get yourself in the door, you get your foot in the door, and then you start working away. And then here we go, time for evaluation time, right? For that 30, 60, or 90. And then you have been so gung-ho on performing that you haven't tracked. And then now you're not able to validate all of that you've contributed within that short amount of time. So I know that that was a lot, so I'll stop there. And if there's any particulars that you want me to hone in on, I can do that as well.
No, I'm happy to have you dig in on that because I love when you talk about that confidence piece. I often say to my clients, you want to show up in an assertive place in negotiations. And that's not aggressive, but having assertiveness just means being confident. And that confidence comes from knowledge, and that knowledge comes from preparation. So it was actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and you've tipped us off on that, which is fabulous. So how important a role do you think preparation is in a negotiation? And what are some of those key elements that you think? What advice would you give for our listeners there about, here are some of the key things you need to make sure you're doing as a regular part of your preparation process before you're going into any negotiation, frankly, in the workplace or beyond?
Yeah, I would say, you just said it, right? Practice, right? Making sure that you are preparing, especially if you are one that finds negotiation at any level uncomfortable, which it shouldn't be, right? Let me just say this. Negotiation is expected, but not a lot of individuals actually take that step to negotiate. And so on the other end, you have the employer who's ready to have that conversation, but it never comes up. And so you're actually doing them a favor. You're taking them off the hook when you don't have that conversation. And so if you understand that it's part of the game, quote unquote, and that they are ready to have that conversation, then just making sure that you are equipped, right? With the necessary knowledge, right? You've done your research before, whatever. Let's just say it's salary negotiation, that you've compared, right? Roles across industries, across different companies. You've done the market research, right? You've done the cost of living. You put into consideration your financial goals and making sure that you know what the standard is within the industry for the type of work that you're doing. And also making sure that if you have gone above and beyond, right? I hate to use that above and beyond. It's so cliche, but if you have excelled, right, above what's on that piece of paper called a JD, job description, making sure that because you've tracked that information, right, making sure because you've had these periodic one-on-ones that you go into these conversations feeling confident and with facts.
Yeah.
Here's the thing with negotiation. It's not a touchy-feely type of thing. It's a fact-based conversation. Here's what I bring to the table. Here's what I've contributed. Here are the outcomes. And here's what I'm requesting. Very fact-based. It's all about the data, right? And if we remove the emotions of it all, then all we're dealing with is data and facts, and who can award or oppose against fact and data. So hopefully that answered some of the questions.
That was so great. And I'd love your thoughts when we're talking about that data that you're bringing to the table. How important do you think? Because I think we often make the mistake of going in and talking about, here are all the things I'm really good at, the things that matter to you. And we forget to talk about that next step, which is, here's how that translates as a massive benefit for you, because the employer is going to be wanting, what does this do for me? So how do you get them to do that transition piece of that prep work?
Yeah, so here's the thing. When you are in a role, whether you are seasoned or you're newly into that role, understanding the department or organization's KPI, key performance indicators, is extremely key, right? And so to answer the question, when you understand the direction that the department, your superior, the executive leadership team, or organization is heading, then you can validate that against your performance and what you've contributed. Now, it's not to say to go in, not to go in and, and share all your accomplishments, but you want to highlight the things that align directly with those KPIs, those that are current and future state, right? And so current state, here is how my contributions have contributed to X, Y, and Z KPIs. Future state, right? Here's what I'm bringing to the table that can impact the direction that we're headed towards as a team, organization, or department. So I would say always default back to this KPIs. And if you say, well, Cebien, my company doesn't have, they never talk about KPIs, be proactive. Bring that to the table in that conversation that you're having with your superior manager and saying, hey, I really want to make sure that I am contributing as much as possible and supporting the organizational goals as best as possible. So what should I be aware of that I'm not currently aware of within my role that can successfully aid to the forward movement of the objectives or goals that the organization has? Is there anything that I am not aware of as a team member? Have that proactive attitude, and that one shows and tells the employer that you are bought in, right, to the vision and the mission, right? And then two, it shows that you take your role in impact and contributions as a team member serious. And then also, it also positions you in a favorable light when it comes time for those conversations about opportunity, performance, etc. So I'll go ahead and yield there.
Yeah, that was pure gold right there, Cebien. For our listeners, go back, re-listen to this episode again and get a pad and pen and take notes. That was gorgeous. And again, just want to really put a pin in that. At the beginning, Cebien was saying as well, connect the dots. Don't be shy about connecting to the dots from here's what I bring to the table. That's part of that prep you're doing. And then connect the dots of what the direct benefit is for the organization. Notice how Cebien was using that we language, talking about teams, so that you're showing that you're a team player. You share their sight for the future. There was so much packed in there. That was gorgeous. I love that. And I'd love for a minute, Cebien, to talk, like, again, if we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, like what impact do you find, if any, that diversity has on negotiations in your experience?
Yeah, and so I think in dealing with diverse work groups, I think the lack, we talked about confidence, right? And so that lack of confidence that they can actually have this conversation and actually move the needle is what I encounter the most. And even speaking to myself, I had to overcome the lack of confidence in really validating the contributions that I brought to the table. But once I overcame that, it was very natural and easy. And that's why I said, because these conversations are expected on the employer side, they're already ready and positioned to have these conversations. They already have options on the table. And so when you are going into performance evaluation, salary negotiation conversations, the employer on the other side they already have pre-laid out if scenarios. If they say this, here's what I'm going to respond with. If they come to the table with this, if they ask for this amount, here's what I'm going to counter back at. And so they're positioned and ready to have that conversation. And so I would say just making sure that you know that if you're performing, and I say if, because I'm not going to just assume that everyone is a
That's true.
If you're actually performing and contributing, and if you have assessed that the culture of the organization does reward performance, so that goes back to doing that research, right? You might put yourself in an organization and want to have a salary negotiation or title negotiation conversation, but the company culture it's not formed that way. And so you're doing yourself a disservice by putting yourself in an environment where that's not part of the culture. But let's say it is part of the culture. Making sure that as long as you have performed, as long as you have the data, the facts to back that up, to go in and have that conversation. But again, doing that pre-work up front. And some of that pre-work is making sure that you know how to have these conversations. And if you don't, tap into resources and individuals that provide that guidance, right? In coaches, consultants, etc. And also making sure that you tap in and having some of these informal conversations with previous, right? I always say, when you're having these types of conversations, go tap into the previous folks that were in these roles that are no longer with the organization because they're no longer bound by any confidentiality or fear of breaking any policies or procedural rules. And you can easily use a tool like a LinkedIn to look these folks up and invite them to a casual conversation. And again, position yourself favorably so you can, one, sound like you know what you're talking about, right? And then two, validate all the points that you're bringing up. So it's not just lip service to
Yeah, that is great advice. And it's interesting. In all the, I think, 160 episodes we've done of this Art of Feminine Negotiation podcast, nobody has raised that issue. And it's so obvious when you say it. Go look for people who are no longer with the organization, who have that freedom to speak, more unfettered freedom to be able to give you information. I think that's great advice. And I also think it was great advice. I love that you pointed out employers come prepped with, if they say this, then this, if they show up this way, then this. And most people, the vast majority of people don't. I'm a big advocate, a part of your prep process of going in, who might they show up as in this interview, right? And I'm going to be prepared for any one of those versions of them. And, so I think such valuable insight. And on that, because we talked about that confidence piece and how that, what an impact that aspect of diversity has on negotiations. But I'd love if you're comfortable talking about, what advice or tips do you have for our listeners on how to handle when you are actually facing, I guess, first, overt discrimination, and then secondly, those more subtle kind of forms of discrimination that show up in these discussions?
Yeah, and so that's a really great question and a very sensitive question, right? And so I'm going to try to be as transparent as possible. If you understand that you are already positioned in a light that is not going to be favorable because of your past observation of the treatment of employees or member groups from whoever that group is that you represent, I want to make sure that you lean on, and I'm going to go back to this, lean on facts, right? Facts is going to be your friend in this scenario. And so it's not, that's why I say remove all of the emotion and feeling, especially when you know that you're already at a disadvantage because of the construct of how these management or individuals are pre-positioned or predisposed to treating an individual like yourself. And I'm saying like yourself because we could be talking about minority groups, we could be talking about LGBTQIA groups, we can be talking about different sex, right? And so depending on how you are already at a disadvantage and you've seen, and I mean, not assuming, but you have actually seen, witnessed from afar or directly the mistreatment of these individuals, then facts are going to play on your side, right? But when I say play on your side, it's going to be what you bring to the table. Aside from that, I would make sure that you understand going into this, don't be afraid of reaching out to professional license-based resources, right? And so making sure that you read company policies, and then you go to these official organizations and understand what the process is if I actually encounter a form of discrimination, a form of direct, deliberate discrimination. What are my steps? Now, I'm not saying you want to be armed and ready to pull the trigger, but at least you want to make sure that you know what words to look out for, right? To the listening ear when you're having these conversations to see if they actually overstep their bounds within legal right. And then you want to make sure that you, one, have conversations with HR, right? And HR is there for a purpose, right? Understand what the processes and procedures are that are set within HR or talent acquisition to escalate issues that are of concern to you as a team member, and how anonymous it can remain, right? And when you have these conversations, it is typically required to be anonymous, but you want to make sure that you understand what the company procedures and policies are that you should follow if, in fact, you encounter any of these discriminatory acts or behaviors. And so documentation is going to be extremely critical, and not documentation within a week or two. We're talking about extensive documentation, repeated patterns of behavior of discrimination for no other reason other than to suppress forward movement or mobility within a role, within salary ranges, et cetera. So I know that was a lot of hopefully that led to the actual question that you asked.
Yeah, no, and important. And I'm glad you took it the extra distance as well. Because, and I love that you talked about that listening for, right? Because, and the opposite is also true. Sometimes we're more sensitive, right? I think that underrepresented groups, whether it's based on gender or race or sexual orientation or disability or any of the possible sort of heads that tend to be the areas where, where we find that discrimination, there are certain things that people say, especially with those more insidious forms of discrimination, where we hear, what do they call it? The dog whistle, right? Where like, I hear that and I know what's underlying it with those gender. And when I first started the practice of law, I'm dating myself here, but at that phase in the mid 80s, like it was overt, right? Like the gender there were no bones about making totally sexually inappropriate comments about legal counsel, right? I mean, in front of legal counsel, it's like, wow. And then within a few years, though, it became politically incorrect. It didn't disappear. It was still there. And it was listening for those undertones of it and knowing when you're facing it and then making the hard decision about how do you deal with it in the moment. Do you call it out? Do you call it out with humor? Do you try to invite them to be the best version of themselves? Like, I know it's important to you to treat people with dignity and respect. And making those intentional choices about how to deal with it is so, so important.
No, that's such a good point. I wanted to go back to the earlier point you made, and because I thought it was so brilliant, right? As if you do belong to a marginalized group, understand that we're already going into these conversations more than likely with a bit of defense mode, right?
Yeah.
And so making sure that we are not on the offensive, right? Waiting for that opportunity to pounce as well.
Yeah.
So I want to call that out as well, because we might be listening,
Yes.
intently listening for a trigger where a trigger doesn't exist. And so I just wanted to point that out because I think that's also a critical part in having these conversations.
Yeah, that's great advice, because there can be that hypersensitivity as well when you've had a conditioned experience, right? And then you expect certain reactions, and we bring that reactivity to the table and get triggered more easily. I think that's great insight. And let's talk about negotiating in the workplace environment. Like, do you find it's different from other forms of negotiation? And what tips would you have for how to navigate negotiations in the work environment as compared to negotiations in your personal life, which we often don't think of those other relationships as being negotiations, but I certainly believe they are.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what I think the skills are. I always talk about transferable skills, right? Because my specialty is within soft skills development. But for me, the negotiation skills are transferable across whether it's our professional or personal life. We do it all the time. As a parent of three, I'm always negotiating. As a parent of three and a single father, I'm always negotiating something either with my kid's mother or my children themselves, right? Or I'm doing it with my peers, right? We negotiate time, right? We negotiate all sorts of things within our personal lives. And so there's no difference. It's just a different environment, right? In a different form of conversation that we're having, whether it's a relaxed conversation that we're having or a more strategic conversation or a more fact-based or data-driven conversation. But all it is having these conversations, trying to come to a mutual lane of understanding or compromise in order to satisfy both parties on the other end and to gain a result, right? And so for me, we negotiate all throughout our lives. And so we shouldn't be sensitive or I would say afraid or intimidated to have negotiation type of conversations because we do it all the time, whether it's casual or formal, negotiating something at some point within our professional and or personal lives. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, you are totally speaking my language there. My whole thing, I believe all of life is a negotiation, as you said, whether with your kids or your intimate partner or service providers, whether it's your phone provider, insurance company, or banking or the workplace, they're all a form of negotiation. So definitely when we're able to show up from that mindset where we recognize it's all about getting those best relationships, it makes such a big difference. Now, what advice or hot tips would you have for negotiating with bullies, or people who have more power than you?
Oh, that's good, right? And so when you are negotiating with a bully, I think you have to really understand, right, their demeanor. And so I talk a lot about core building and relationship building in the workplace. And so if you find that you're going into these critical or sensitive conversations with someone that you've been unable to build a rapport with, then again, I'm going to go back to making sure that you are coming into it with information. And then not being afraid to come into that conversation with confidence, right? And not being afraid to push back and push back in a way that is professional, right? And so if they say something that is more on the emotional side, making sure that you redirect that conversation by saying, hey, I want to make sure that we're keeping this fact-based and that we're sticking to the conversation at hand. This has nothing to do really with your personal feeling towards me. It's really how am I contributing to the organization? Does it make sense? Is there actual areas of performance, right, that you are concerned about that I need to be aware of? and then continuing the conversation onward. But you have to be able to stand your ground, right?
Yeah.
Stand your ground. And if you know that it is someone that quote unquote is a bully that tends to be inappropriate, not being afraid to ask for that mediator to be in the room with you. They might not be engaged in the conversation, but it is perfectly fine to say, you know what, I am not comfortable having this conversation directly one-on-one. Is there a possibility or an opportunity for us to include a peer or another supervisory team member in this conversation so we can make sure that the conversation is fairly had on both sides? And so go outside of the box in thinking when you are dealing with these sort of intimidating characters or someone, quote unquote, that would be deemed a bully in the workplace.
That's so good. And again, it's about that confidence to self-advocate and that confidence to ask, just simply ask for what you want, ask for what you need to help facilitate it. I think that's great. And you talked about rapport building and, we were talking about all of life being a negotiation. What do you find, or what would you say are the greatest, skills or hallmarks that make for the most effective negotiators?
So here's the thing, think of negotiation. And when most people think of negotiation, they forget that there's a lead up to negotiation, right? And so if I go into a cold negotiation conversation, meaning I performed as a team member and this is my first sort of real one-on-one time with my manager and I'm spewing out all that I've contributed, and then I get some pushback and then I'm surprised at that.
Yeah.
Did I actually take the time, right? 3 months ahead of time, a year ahead of time to really make sure that I'm building that relationship? Did I make sure that I advocated, right? Self-advocated, use that word, for myself by letting my supervisor and or peers, right? And or leadership team know of my personal development goals, my professional development goals, and my career development goals as it relates to the organization? Have I been vocal, right, about where I see myself in X amount of years? And so a lot of this relationship building piece needs to happen prior to these conversations that we have when it comes to the topic of negotiation. So having these one-on-ones, making sure that you're submitting these weekly or bi-weekly performance summaries, making sure that you're tracking your performance, making sure that you have these sheets of contributions, making sure that you also find opportunities to have casual conversations. At the end of the day, we're human.
Yeah. So true.
Finding times to be relatable.
Yes.
Be relatable. It doesn't matter if you are in a hybrid, in-person, or even remote, fully remote workplace. Yeah. There are strategies and tactics to use so you can get to know one another. And it doesn't really take all that much, but you do have to put forth active effort to make sure that you are building genuine relationship, at least putting the effort forth to know that, to let individuals know what your career goals are, what you want to learn about them, how you want to contribute, and does it make sense for the goals that you set against the actual roles that you're doing in your day-to-day? Is this leading up to where I see myself as a supervisor? If it doesn't, where can I fill in that gap? Are there extra projects that I can take on? Is there anything I can take off of your table? Can I lead team meetings? Are you open to sort of creative ideas about how we function in our work group or in our work silos? And so these are, again, being proactive, showing initiative, showing buy-in, but again, having these conversations leading up to the negotiation of those that you're having with your employer.
Yeah, so good. And interesting, I want to unpack, because one of the things that you said that really struck me in that there's so much gold there, but seeing you talking about doing this lead up idea, I love to think of negotiations as a circle, right? That it's this constant. So you've got your pre-formal negotiation, the preparation phase, which is all of those months leading up to it is part of that process. Then you've got the people think of negotiation as just the sitting across from each other, the formal negotiation part, but that whole pre-phase, then you've got your negotiation phase, and then you've got your follow-up. Like after you have that negotiation, what went wrong? What could I have done better? Why did that particular area go sideways? And how could I have brought different skill set to have that, handled it better next time? And then you go right into preparing for the next one, right? Setting the groundwork. I think that's so important. I love that you talked about that. And what do you see as the key reasons that negotiations fail in your experience?
I think you just answered it. Not asking questions.
Yeah.
Not asking questions. What a perfect or opportune time, right? After a negotiation conversation to really take that informal opportunity to say, hey, one, thank you for having the conversation with me. Although it didn't go favorably or as favorably as I wanted, to your point, going into the next conversation, what is it? What's the missing gap, right? Where I could have made this better for both you and myself? What should I be looking out for? How can I correct my performance now or my contributions now, right, to make sure that this is a more fruitful and beneficial conversation the next go around? And so I think not asking questions pre, right? Making sure that you have those set expectations of what's expected when you're going into these conversations, and then the post, right? Following up and making sure that you are not just removing yourself from the conversation unsatisfied and probably a little aggravated because it didn't go the way you want, and getting aggravated and frustrated and looking elsewhere, but making sure that you are showing the employer that you are committed, right, to the role, you're committed to the organization and the department goals, and that you truly want to know how to best position yourself in a better light so you can be a complete contributor and not a 50% contributor. And so I think asking questions is critical pre and post the negotiation conversation.
Oh, thanks for that. And Cebien, I can't believe how quick our time is going. I could be talking all afternoon to you on this. We're going to have to come back for do a part 2 on this to dig even deeper on some of these. And I normally love to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had? And this doesn't have to be about your current career. It could be anything, one of those moments that shifts how you look at the world or show up.
Yeah, what an excellent question. I posted a piece of content on LinkedIn recently, and it was mainly based around affirmations, right? Saying that I am enough in various forms. And so for me, that mindset shift, right, Cindy, I think we get in this, we're human, right? Back to that point, we get in this comparison mode at times when we see others accomplishing the feats that we set for ourselves, right? And so for me, I often, right, even at this stage of the game with a couple of decades under my belt, I still encounter these moments where I have to self-reflect and remind myself that I am me and I am purposely and uniquely made myself for a reason. And that in itself is no reason for me to compare because I am me. No one else can be Cebien Alty. And so that mindset shift in understanding that I am enough just the way I am, and I have the tools, resources, and access either within me or around me to tap into at any given moment to activate to accomplish the goals that I've set for myself is one of the most critical, I would say, mindset shifts that I have made and that I am very aware of and vigilantly aware of that I have to be protective of, because I will get into those modes where I'm like, why is that happening for them and not for me? Or I thought about that first, but yet I didn't. So just understanding that I have everything that I need, and it's all up to me to just activate so I can actually achieve the goals that I've set for myself.
Oh, that was beautiful. And thank you for giving us the language around that. And for our listeners, I actually encourage you, go back and either make a clip of that and then get it transcribed, write down that as your personal affirmation as well. The language that Cebien used there was so powerful and affirming, and is going to help you step into that confidence that Cebien's been talking about, sort of as the theme throughout this. So thank you so much for being here, Cebien. You've shared some incredible gems with us. So appreciative to have you share your time with us. And for our listeners out there, make sure to follow up and learn more about Cebien as well. LinkedIn is his primary. He's the LinkedIn master. I'm going to actually try and follow up with him and pick his brain about that because I'm terrible on LinkedIn. But make sure to check out Cebien at LinkedIn. And it's linkedin.com, and it is just /Cebien, right?
Yep, I always say I'm the only Cebien Alty on LinkedIn. Pretty easy to find. And so if you just spell my full name out, you will find my bright smiling face on LinkedIn. Would love to connect and build a relationship and support as in any way that I can.
So great. And feel free to check him out on Twitter as well. He's got I Can See Beyond, with the C Beyond, the name of his organization as well, or on Instagram as well on CBeyond Enterprise. And we'll make sure to put those in the show notes for you. And again, for any of our listeners, whether you're a job seeker or an employer, if you're interested in getting some more insights, certainly in the DEI area and beyond, make sure to reach out to Cebien. You will not regret it. And I am sure you've all just got loads of value from this episode. I know I have. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. Feel free to rate and review us. We always love that. And share it with anyone that you think could benefit from the messages that we share here. And definitely be sharing this episode. Lots of incredible gems here. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, I invite you to go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so that you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve in life, from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.